Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, I'm not competent, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? If so, you're ready to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, I'm not competent. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of then. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, Mom and Dad thought you were incompetent, but they were just plain wrong? Couldn't the idea Mom and Dad thought you were incompetent, but were just plain wrong, explain those events in your childhood just as well as your original interpretation, I'm not competent? Here's what your second friend says. Mom and Dad were mad or annoyed because they weren't patient, not because you weren't competent. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that I'm not competent? Here's a third possible interpretation of those childhood events. Maybe you weren't competent as a kid, but that doesn't mean you'll never be competent at any time in the future. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your original interpretation, that I'm not competent? Those experiences with your parents could be explained in many different ways. Here's one your fourth friend suggests. Mom and Dad's annoyance wasn't because you were incompetent. They just had unrealistic expectations for a child your age. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain these events just as well as the statement, I'm not competent? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth. Merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events? Right. Please continue to interact totally with this program in order for it to work. And that includes answering my questions out loud, even if your answer is a simple yes or no. So let me repeat the question. Do you get that I'm not competent is not a fact? It's not the truth, but just a truth? Merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier childhood events? I'll bet you do now. With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that those times when you either didn't do things the way they wanted or they did too much for you could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief I'm not competent? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to conclude, I'm not competent. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see, I'm not competent in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief I'm not competent, you probably did feel it too. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. Didn't it seem as if you saw I'm not competent? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, Morty, I can see evidence I'm not competent. I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Remember what I explained when you were eliminating the earlier beliefs. What happened was that you looked at events that could have had many different meanings and chose one, which in this case was, I'm not competent. By giving that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Now that you know that it seemed as if you saw I'm not competent as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see I'm not competent? If you did, what does I'm not competent look like? Could you really point to it? Does it have a color, a shape, a location? Even if your parents said those very words to you, you still only saw them say it. You never heard that it was true. There are as many interpretations of your parents saying something as there is of their behavior. You can't see that anything they say is necessarily true, or even that they believed it themselves. Is it real to you now that you saw events, but never really did see I'm not competent? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I'm not competent looks like, is it clear now you never really saw it? Since you never really saw I'm not competent, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was the reaction of one or both of your parents when you did something they weren't happy about, or you saw them doing lots of things for you and not allowing you to do them? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was I'm not competent. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. I'm going to make an important distinction between consequences and meaning. There clearly were consequences to your parents' behavior. You got yelled at or punished, or your parents didn't listen to you, or you didn't get what you wanted. But was there any meaning to their behavior? Let me explain what I mean by meaning. Imagine you're in a room and someone you know comes in and doesn't speak to you. What might you automatically think? For example, you might have just said, they're mad at me, or they're being rude, or they had something on their mind and didn't notice me. Notice, however, that what you said is the meaning you gave to the event. And where did the meaning you gave their behavior come from? That's right, your mind. Meaning is in your mind. So if meaning is in your mind, is there any meaning inherent in your parents' behavior? Or any other events for that matter? Of course, the answer is no. See, it's not that what happened to you as a child didn't matter. It just had no meaning. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about you, about other people, or about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about you from knowing about how your parents treated you when you were a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything for sure about the kind of person you really are? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Your mom and dad sounded annoyed or angry and perhaps punished you when you didn't do what they wanted you to do, when they wanted you to do it, or sometimes they didn't let you do some things and did them for you. And finally, if you never saw I'm not competent out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that I'm not competent has only ever existed in your mind, that you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. Now, if the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel I'm not competent? It did, didn't it? Now, earlier you realized that the events have no meaning. So is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel I'm not competent? or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if Mom and Dad's behavior couldn't have made you feel I'm not competent, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. All right, you felt I'm not competent only because that's the meaning you had already given to your parents' behavior. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and had shown you the interpretations we talked about a few minutes ago for your parents' behavior. And after that conversation, you concluded, my parents are having unreasonable expectations of me. Their annoyance has nothing to do with whether or not I'm competent. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child, and Mom and Dad get annoyed at you again for something you did or didn't do. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, my parents have expectations of me that are too high for a child my age. That's why they get annoyed, not because I'm not competent. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. If your belief was based on the fact that your parents would do things for you, imagine you had decided their behavior means they thought I couldn't do those things, but that doesn't mean they were right, not because I'm not competent. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. And when you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel I'm not competent? Probably not. And if you didn't feel I'm not competent then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no, isn't it? So Mom and Dad's behavior never caused you to feel I'm not competent. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by external events, they're only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when your parents were annoyed or angry didn't tell you anything at all about whether or not you were competent? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, I'm not competent. Does it still feel like it's true at all, even a little bit? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that when we form beliefs, we give meaning to events that have no real meaning. We then think we observe the meaning in the events, out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Now take another deep breath and say, I'm not competent, out loud. I bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw I'm not competent in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.